So I thought I'd start here with a story from Persia by Anonymous. I think a couple of these here are from anonymous authors, or I assume it's kind of the kind of stories that are sort of gathered or collected by sort of people who are collecting local stories and folklore and things like that. So I would imagine this is the kind of story that is sort of oral tradition, spoken to people and told in your typical storytelling tradition, rather than necessarily written down. So yeah, author is unknown. But yes, I thought we should start with this. This is The Sailor and the Pearl Merchant. In the city of Basra there was a man, Abdul Farawis, who was the chief of the sailors of the town, for in the great ocean there was no port at which he had not landed. One day, as he sat on the seashore with his sailors round him, an old man arrived in a ship, landed where Abul Farawis was sitting, and said, "Friend, I desire you to give me your ship for 6 months, and I will pay you whatever you desire." "I demand 1,000 gold dinars," said the sailor, and at once received the gold from the old man, who, before departing, said that he would come again on the next day, and warned Abul Farawis that there was to be no holding back. The sailor took home his gold, made his ship ready, and then, taking leave of his wife and sons, he went down to the shore, where he found the old man waiting for him with a slave and 20 ass-loads of empty sacks. Abul Farawis greeted him, and together they loaded the ship and set sail. Taking a particular star for their mark, they sailed for 3 months, when an island appeared to one side of them. For this the old man steered, and they soon landed upon it. Having loaded his slave with some sacks, the old man with his companions set out towards a mountain which they could see in the distance. This they reached after some hours of travel, and climbed to the summit, upon which they found a broad plain where more than 200 pits had been dug. The old man then explained to the sailor that he was a merchant, and that he had, on that spot, found a mine of jewels. "Now that I have given you my confidence," he continued, "I expect faithfulness from you too. I desire you to go down into this pit and send up sufficient pearls to fill these sacks. Half I will give to you, and we shall be able to spend the rest of our lives in luxury." The sailor thereupon asked how the pearls had found their way into these pits, to which the old man replied that there was a passage connecting the pits with the sea. Along this passage oysters swam, and settled in the pits, where by chance he had come upon them. He explained further that he had only brought the sailor because he needed help, but he desired not to disclose the matter to anyone else. With great eagerness then the sailor descended into the pit, and there found oysters in great numbers. The old man let down a basket to him, which he filled again and again, until at last the merchant cried out that the oysters were useless, for they contained no pearls. Abul Farawis therefore left that pit, and descended into another, where he found pearls in great number. By the time night fell he was utterly wearied, and called out to the old man to help him out of the pit. In reply, the merchant shouted down that he intended to leave him in the pit, for he feared that Abul Farawis might kill him for the sake of the jewels. With great vehemence the sailor protested that he was innocent of any such intention, but the old man was deaf to his entreaties, and, making his way back to the ship, sailed away. For 3 days Abul Farawis remained, hungry and thirsty. As he struggled to find a way out, he came upon many human bones, and understood that the accursed old man had betrayed many others in the same fashion. In desperation he dug about, and at last he saw a small opening, which he enlarged with his hands. Soon it was big enough for him to crawl through, and he found himself in the darkness, standing upon mud. Along this he walked carefully, and then felt himself suddenly plunged to his neck in water, which was salt to the taste, and he knew that he was in the passage that led to the sea. He swam along in this for some way, till, in front of him, there appeared a faint light. Greatly heartened by the sight of it, he swam vigorously until he reached the mouth of the passage. On emerging, he found himself facing the sea, and threw himself on his face to give thanks for his delivery. Then he rose, and a little distance from him he found the cloak which he had left behind when he set out for the mountain, but of the old merchant there was no sign, and the ship had disappeared. Full of trouble and despondency, he sat down at the water's brink, wondering what he was to do. As he gazed at the sea, there came into view a ship, and he saw that it was filled with men. At sight of it, the sailor leaped from his place. Snatching his turban from his head, he waved it with all his might in the air, and shouted at the top of his voice. But as they approached, he decided not to tell his rescuers the truth of his presence there. Therefore, when they landed and asked how he came to be on the island, he told them that his ship had been wrecked at sea, that he clung to a plank and had been washed to the shore. They praised his good fortune at his escape, and in reply to his questions with regard to the place of their origin, told him that they had sailed from Abyssinia, and were then on their way to Hindustan. At this, Abul Farawis hesitated, saying that he had no business in Hindustan. They assured him, however, that they would meet ships going to Basra and would hand him over to one of them. He agreed then to go with them, and for 40 days they sailed without seeing any inhabited spot. At last he asked them whether they had not mistaken their way, and they admitted that for 5 days they had been sailing without knowing whither they were going or what direction to follow. Altogether, therefore, set themselves to praying, and remained in prayer for some time. Soon afterwards, as they sailed, something in appearance like a minaret emerged from the sea, and they seemed to behold the flash of a Chinese mirror. Also they perceived that their ship, without their rowing, and without any greater force of wind, began to move at great speed over the water. In great amazement the sailors ran to Abul Farawis and asked him what had come to the ship that it moved so fast. He raised his eyes and groaned deeply as in the distance he saw a mountain that rose out of the sea. In terror he clapped his hand to his eyes and shouted out, "We shall all perish! My father continually warned me that if ever I lost my way upon the sea, I must steer to the east, for if I went to the west, I would certainly fall into the lion's mouth. When I asked him what the lion's mouth was, he told me that the Almighty had created a great hole in the midst of the ocean, at the foot of a mountain. That is the lion's mouth. Over 100 leagues of water it will attract a ship, and no vessel which encounters the mountain ever rises again. I believe that this is a place, and that we are caught." In great terror the sailors saw their ship being carried like the wind against the mountain. Soon it was caught in the whirlpool, where the wrecks of 10,000 ancient ships were being carried around in the swirling current. The sailors and merchants in the ship crowded to Abul Farawis, begging him to tell them what they could do. He cried out to them to prepare all the ropes which they had in the ship. He would then swim out of the whirlpool and onto the shore at the foot of the mountain, where he would make fast to some stout tree. Then they were to cast their ropes to him, and so he would rescue them from their peril. By great good fortune the current cast him out upon the shore, and he made the rope of his ship fast to a stout tree. Then, as soon as was possible, the sailor climbed to the top of the mountain, in search of food, for neither he nor his shipmates had eaten for some days. When he reached the summit, he found a pleasant plain stretching away in front of him, and in the midst of it he saw a lofty arch made of green stone. As he approached it and entered, he observed a tall pillar made of steel, from which there hung by a chain a great drum of a Damascus bronze covered with a lion's skin. From the arch also hung a great tablet of bronze, upon which was engraved the following inscription: "O thou that dost reach this place, know that when Alexander voyaged round the world and reached the lion's mouth, he had been made aware of this place of calamity. He was therefore accompanied by 4,000 wise men, whom he summoned and whom he commanded to provide a means of escape from this calamitous spot. For long the philosophers pondered on the matter, until at last Plato caused this drum to be made, whose quality is that if anyone, being caught in the whirlpool, can come forth and strike the drum 3 times, he will bring out his ship to the surface. When the sailor had read the inscription, he quickly made his way to the shore and told his fellows of it. After much debate, he agreed to risk his life by staying on the island and striking the drum, on condition that they would return to Basra on their escape, and give to his wife and sons 1/2 of what treasure they had in the ship. He bound them with an oath to do this, and then returned to the arch. Taking up a club, he struck the drum 3 times, and as the mighty roar of it echoed from the hills, the ship, like an arrow shot from a bow, was flung out of the whirlpool. Then, with a cry of farewell to Abul Farawis from the crew, they sailed to Basra, where they gave 1/2 the treasure which they had to the sailor's family. With great mourning the wife and family of Abul Farawis celebrated his loss, but he, after sleeping soundly in the archway and giving thanks to his Maker for preserving him alive, made his way again to the summit of the mountain. As he advanced across the plain, he saw black smoke arising from it, and also in the plain were rivers, of which he passed 9. He was like to die of hunger and weariness, when suddenly he perceived on one side a meadow, in which flocks of sheep were grazing. In great joy he thought that he was at last reaching human habitation, and as he came towards the sheep, he saw with them a youth, tall in stature as a mountain, and covered with a tattered cloak of red felt, though his head and body were clad in mail. The sailor greeted him, and received greeting in reply, and also the question, "Whence come you?" Abul Farawis answered that he was a man upon whom catastrophe had fallen, and so related his adventures to the shepherd. He heard it with a laugh, and said, "Count yourself fortunate to have escaped from that abyss. Do not fear now, I will bring you to a village." Saying this, he set bread and milk before him, and bade him eat. When he had eaten, he said, "You cannot remain here all day. I will take you to my house, where you may rest for a time." Together they descended to the foot of the mountain, where stood a gateway. Against it leaned a mighty stone, which 100 men could not have lifted, but the shepherd, putting his hand into a hole in the stone, lifted it from the gateway, and admitted Abul Farawis. Then he restored the stone to its place, and continued on his way. When the sailor had passed through the gateway, he saw before him a beautiful garden, in which were trees laden with fruit. In the midst of them was a kiosk, and this the sailor thought must be the shepherd's house. He entered and looked about from the roof, but though he saw many houses, there was no person in sight. He descended, therefore, and walked to the nearest house, which he entered. Upon crossing the threshold, he beheld 10 men, all naked and all so fat that their eyes were almost closed. With their heads down upon their knees, all were weeping bitterly. But at the sound of his footsteps they raised their heads and called out, "Who are you?" He told them that the shepherd had brought him and offered him hospitality. A great cry arose from them as they heard this. "Here," they said, "is another unfortunate who has fallen like ourselves into the clutch of this monster. He is a vile creature who in the guise of a shepherd goes about and seizes men and devours them. We are all merchants whom adverse winds have brought here. He has seized us and keeps us in this fashion." With a groan, the sailor thought that now at last he was undone. At that moment he saw the shepherd coming, saw him let the sheep into the garden, and then close the gateway with the stone before entering the kiosk. He was carrying a bag full of almonds, dates, and pistachio nuts, with which he approached, and, giving it to the sailor, he told him to share it with the others. Abul Farawis could say nothing, but sat down and ate the food with his companions. When they had finished their meal, the shepherd returned to them, took one of them by the hand, and then in sight of them all slew, roasted, and devoured him. When he was sated, he brought out a skin of wine and drank until he fell into a drunken sleep. Then the sailor turned to his companions and said, "Since I am to die, let me first destroy him. If you will give me your help, I will do so." They replied that they had no strength left. But he, seeing the 2 long spits on which the ogre had roasted his meat, put them into the fire until they were red hot, and then plunged them into the monster's eyes. With a great cry, the shepherd leaped up and tried to seize his tormentor, who sprang away and eluded him. Running to the stone, the shepherd moved it aside and began to let out the sheep one by one, in the hope that when the garden was emptier, he could the more easily capture the sailor. Abulfarawis understood his intention. Without delay, he slew a sheep, put on the skin, and tried to pass through. But the shepherd knew as soon as he felt him that this was not a sheep, and leapt after him in pursuit. Abulfarawis flung off the pelt and ran like the wind. Soon he came to the sea, and into this he plunged, while the shepherd after a few steps returned to the shore, for he could not swim. Full of terror, the sailor swam till he reached the other side of the mountain. There he met an old man who greeted him, and after hearing his adventure, fed him and took him into his house. But soon, to his horror, Abulfarawis found that this old man also was an ogre. With great cunning he told the ogre's wife that he could make many useful implements for her house, and she persuaded her husband to save him. After many days in the house, he was sent away to the care of a shepherd, and put to guard sheep. Day by day he planned to escape, but there was only one way across the mountain, and that was guarded. One day, as he wandered in a wood, he found the hollow trunk of a tree, a store of honey. He found in the hollow trunk of a tree a store of honey, of which he told the shepherd's wife when he went home. The next day, therefore, the woman sent her husband with Abulfarawis, telling him to bring home some of the honey. But on the way, the sailor leaped upon him and bound him to a tree. Then, taking the shepherd's ring, he returned and told the woman that her husband had given him leave to go, and that he sent his ring in token of this. But the woman was cunning and asked, "Why did not my husband come himself to tell me this?" Seizing him by the cloak, she told him that she would go with him and find out the truth. The sailor, however, tore himself free and again fled to the sea, where he thought that he might escape death. In haste and terror he swam for many hours, until at last he espied a ship full of men, who steered towards him and took him on board. Full of wonder they asked how he came there, and he related to them all his adventures. It happened by great good fortune that the ship's captain had business at one place only on the coast, and that from there he was sailing to Basra. In the space of a month, therefore, Abulfarawis was restored to his family, to the joy of them all. The many dangers and sufferings of the sailor had turned his hair white. For many days he rested, and then one day as he walked by the seashore, that same old man who had before hired his ship again appeared. Without recognizing him, he asked if he would lend his ship on hire for 6 months. Abulfarawis agreed to do so for 1,000 dinars of gold, which the old man at once paid to him, saying that he would come in a boat on the morrow, ready to depart. When the ancient departed, the sailor took home the money to his wife, who bade him beware not to cast himself again into danger. He replied that he must be avenged, not only for himself, but also for the 1,000 Muslims whom the villainous old man had slain. The next day, therefore, the sailor took on board the old man and a slave, and for 3 months they sailed, until they once more reached the island of Pearls. There they made fast the ship on the shore, and taking sacks, they ascended to the top of the mountain. Once arrived there, the old man made the same request to Abulfarawis as before, namely that he should go down into the pits and send up pearls. The sailor replied that he was unacquainted with the place, and preferred that the old man should go down first, in order to prove that there was no danger. He answered that there surely was no danger. He had never in his life harmed even an ant, and he would of a certainty never send Abulfarawis down into the pits if he knew any peril lay there. But the sailor was obstinate, saying that until he knew how to carry it out, he could not undertake the task. Very reluctantly, therefore, the old man allowed himself to be lowered into the first pit by a basket and a rope. He filled the basket with oysters and sent it up, crying out, "You see, there is nothing to do harm in this pit. Draw me up now, for I am an old man and have no more strength left." The sailor replied, "Now you are there, it were better if you remained there to complete your task. Tomorrow I myself will go into another pit, and will send up so many pearls as to fill the ship." For a long time the old man worked, sending up pearls, and at last he cried out again, "Oh, my brother, I am utterly wearied. Draw me out now." Then the sailor turned upon him with fury, and cried out, "How is it that thou dost see ever thine own trouble, and never that of others? Thou misbegotten dog, art thou blind that thou dost not know me? I am Abul Farawis, the sailor, whom long ago you left in one of these pits. By the favour of Allah I was delivered, and now it is your turn. Open your eyes to the truth, and remember what you have done to so many men." The old man cried aloud for mercy, but it availed him nothing, for Abul Farawis brought a great stone and covered up the mouth of the pit. The slave too he overwhelmed with threats, and then together they carried down the pearls to the ship, in which they set sail. In 3 months they arrived at Basra. There Abul Farawis related his adventures to the amazement of all. Thenceforth he abandoned the sea and adopted a life of ease. Finally he died, and this story remains in memory of him. It's interesting, actually, because that's basically a Hercules story. Also, Harpers and Joe, hello! Congrats on your amazing Desert Bus art auction yesterday. Very, very well deserved. That was pretty amazing. Also, I hope you're well. And yeah, that was many congratulations to that. That was rather wonderful. But yeah, that was your typical kind of revenge story. Also, hey Luna, that was a nice story. Yeah, it's the island from the Odyssey with the. Oh, it's not Hercules. It's Odysseus. My bad. With the one-eyed giant. Is that Odysseus where he goes in and pretends to be a sheep and the Cyclops doesn't realise he's a human. Oh, it is I get very confused with those two. But yeah, it's interesting that that's kind of a story that has crossed country borders, as it were. But yeah, wouldn't say necessarily the hero of the story is a hero, but also the old man did kind of have it coming. But yes, it's lovely to see so many people here, by the way. The old books they play some Mario game. Nice. Yes. But yes, I think I shall read another one. How long is this one? Let me just check. Yeah. So first we had Persia. We had a story from Persia. And now we're going to be very boring and go back to the UK because I found some Dickens. Dickens is great. He writes well. So I'm going to read, and again, just as a general kind of disclaimer, because a lot of these stories are very old, there is going to be like some uses of words, not necessarily bad uses of words, but like some uses of words that are going to mean sort of what they originally meant. For example, this one's called The Old Man's Tale of the Queer Client. Not queer as in what we like associate with queer now, but queer as in strange or odd. Not as in like not as in queerness is odd now, of course it's not, but like the alternate use of the word, the sort of the original use of it. So although you could also just read this as The Old Man's Tale of the Queer Client, which would be pretty great, quite frankly. Just Dickens standing up for LGBTQ rights. Pretty cool. But sadly it's not that. But we can imagine it was. Yay! Gay pride, whoop. It's I always enjoy like reading old stories, and when the word queer comes up, it's just like, yes, I'm just gonna read it like that now because it's great. Because often, like the very old-fashioned way of describing someone who is slightly odd, or I guess kooky, or quirky, or whatever, they're not actually that quirky. They're just kind of fine and normal. It's like they've got some kind of eccentricity, but like, yeah, don't we all? It's just like they're not weird. They're sort of fine. So yeah, it's kind of better. Oh, good. Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you're here anyway, Harper's. Yeah, that's short stories. Basically, what we're trying to do with this is one of us will be sort of reading a longer novel, and the other one will be sort of doing, shorter stories, so that you can just pop in. You don't have to worry about catching up on numerous chapters. Also, hey, Zora, numerous chapters of currently 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is Sam's reading, and it's basically just like fish facts and various other facts. Having a family listening session. Oh, hello everyone. I hope you're all well. I bet it's less cold in New Zealand than it is here. Again, not allowed to complain. There are people in chat who probably have it a lot colder, but it's finally feeling quite festive and cold and stuff. But anyway, I will stop. Math, yes, exactly, maths and fish facts. Okay, yeah. You're roasting, yeah, I can imagine. And yes, what Azura said, the Totoro wall hanging was insane. It was amazing. Just incredible. 28 degrees less than body temperature is cold. Yes, you're not wrong. But anyway, I shall stop chatting and actually get back to, the thing that I'm meant to be doing during this stream, which is reading. So this is The Old Man's Tale of the Queer Client from the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. It matters little, said the old man, where or how I picked up this brief history. If I were to relate it in the order in which it reached me, I should commence in the middle, and when I had arrived at the conclusion, go back for a beginning. It is enough for me to say that some of its circumstances passed before my own eyes. For the remainder, I know them to have happened, and there are some persons yet living who will remember them but all too well. In the Borough High Street, near St. George's Church, and on the same side of the way, stands, as most people know, the smallest of our debtors' prisons, the Marshalsea. Although in later times it has been a very different place from the sink of filth and dirt it once was, even its improved condition holds out but little temptation to the extravagant, or consolation to the provident. The condemned felon has as good a yard for air and exercise in Newgate as the insolvent debtor in the Marshalsea prison. It may be my fancy, or it may be that I cannot separate the place from the old recollections associated with it, but this part of London I cannot bear. The street is broad, the shops are spacious, the noise of passing vehicles, the footsteps of a perpetual stream of people, all the busy sounds of traffic, resound in it from morn to midnight. But the streets around are mean and close, poverty and debauchery lie festering in the crowded alleys, want and misfortune are pent up in the narrow prison. An air of gloom and dreariness seems, in my eyes at least, to hang about the scene, and to impart to it a squalid and sickly hue. Many eyes that have long since been closed in the grave have looked round upon that scene lightly enough, when entering the gate of the old Marshalsea prison for the first time, for despair seldom comes with the first severe shock of misfortune. A man has confidence in untried friends. He remembers the many offers of service so freely made by his boon companions when he wanted them not. He has hope, the hope of happy inexperience, and however he may bend beneath the first shock, it springs up in his bosom, and flourishes there for a brief space until it droops beneath the blight of disappointment and neglect. How soon have those same eyes, deeply sunken in the head, glared from faces wasted with famine and sallow from confinement, in days when it was no figure of speech to say debtors rotted in prison with no hope of release and no prospect of liberty. The atrocity in its full extent no longer exists, but there is enough of it left to give rise to occurrences that make the heart bleed. 20 years ago, that pavement was worn with the footsteps of a mother and child, who, day by day, so surely as the morning came, presented themselves at the prison gate. Often, after a night of restless misery and anxious thoughts, were they there, a full hour too soon, and then the young mother, turning meekly away, would lead the child to the old bridge, and, raising him in her arms to show him the glistening water, tinted with the light of the morning sun, and stirring with all the bustling preparations for business and pleasure that the river presented at that early hour, endeavour to interest his thoughts in the objects before him. But she would quickly set him down, and, hiding her face in her shawl, give vent to the tears that blinded her, for no expression of interest or amusement lighted up his thin and sickly face. His recollections were few enough, but they were all of one kind, all connected with the poverty and misery of his parents. Hour after hour had he sat on his mother's knee, and with childish sympathy watched the tears that stole down her face, and then crept quietly away into some dark corner, and sobbed himself to sleep. The hard realities of the world, with many of its worst privations, hunger and thirst, and cold and want, had all come home to him, from the first dawnings of reason, and though the form of childhood were there, its light heart, its merry laugh, and sparkling eyes were wanting. The father and mother looked upon this, and upon each other, with thoughts of agony they dared not breathe in words. The healthy, strong-made man, who would have borne almost any fatigue of active exertion, was wasting beneath the close confinement and unhealthy atmosphere of a crowded prison. The slight and delicate woman was sinking beneath the combined effects of bodily and mental illness. The child's young heart was breaking. Winter came, and with it weeks of cold and heavy rain. The poor girl had removed to a wretched apartment close to the spot of her husband's imprisonment, and though the change had been rendered necessary by their increasing poverty, she was happier now, for she was nearer him. For 2 months she and her little companion watched the opening of the gate as usual. One day she failed to come, for the first time. Another morning arrived, and she came alone. The child was dead. They little know who coldly talk of the poor man's bereavements as a happy release from pain to the departed, and a merciful relief from expense to the survivor. Little they know, I say, what the agony of those bereavements is. A silent look of affection and regard when all other eyes are turned coldly away, the consciousness that we possess the sympathy and affection of one being when all others have deserted us, is a hold, a stay, a comfort in the deepest affliction, which no wealth could purchase or power bestow. The child had sat at his parents' feet for hours together, with his little hands patiently folded in each other, and his thin wan face raised towards them. They had seen him pine away from day to day, and though his brief existence had been a joyless one, and he was now removed to that peace and rest which, child as he was, he had never known in this world, they were his parents, and his loss sunk deep into their souls. It was plain to those who looked upon the mother's altered face that death must soon close the scene of her adversity and trial. Her husband's fellow prisoners shrank from obtruding on his grief and misery, and left to himself alone the small room he had previously occupied in common with 2 companions. She shared it with him, and lingering on without pain, but without hope, her life ebbed slowly away. She had fainted one evening in her husband's arms, and he had borne her to the open window to revive her with the air, when the light of the moon falling full upon her face showed him a change upon her features which made him stagger beneath her weight like a helpless infant. "Set me down, George," she said faintly. He did so, and seating himself beside her, covered his face with his hands, and burst into tears. "It is very hard to leave you, George," she said, But it is God's will, and you must bear it for my sake. Oh, how I thank him for having taken our boy. He is happy and in heaven now. What would he have done here without his mother?" "You shall not die, Mary, you shall not die," said the husband, starting up. He paced hurriedly to and fro, striking his head with his clenched fists, then reseating himself beside her and supporting her in his arms, added more calmly, "Rouse yourself, my dear. Pray, pray do. You will revive yet." "Never again, George, never again," said the dying woman. "Let them lay me by my poor boy now, but promise me that if ever you leave this dreadful place, and should grow rich, you will have us removed to some quiet country churchyard, a long, long way off, very far from here, where we can rest in peace. Dear George, promise me you will." I do," said the man, throwing himself passionately on his knees before her. "Speak to me, Mary, another word, one look, but one." He ceased to speak, for the arm that clasped his neck grew stiff and heavy. A deep sigh escaped from the wasted form before him, the lips moved, and a smile played upon the face, but the lips were pallid, and the smile faded into a rigid and ghastly stare. He was alone in the world. That night, in the silence and desolation of his miserable room, the wretched man knelt down by the dead body of his wife, and called on God to witness a terrible oath, that from that hour he devoted himself to revenge her death and that of his child, that thenceforth to the last moment of his life his whole energies should be directed to this one object, that his revenge should be protracted and terrible, that his hatred should be undying and inextinguishable, and should hunt its object through the world. The deepest despair, and passion scarcely human, had made such fierce ravages on his face and form, that in that one night, that his companions in misfortune shrunk affrighted from him as he passed by. His eyes were bloodshot and heavy, his face a deadly white, and his body bent as if with age. He had bitten his underlip nearly through in the violence of his mental suffering, and the blood which had flowed from the wound had trickled down his chin and stained his shirt and neckerchief. No tear or sound of complaint escaped him, but the unsettled look and disordered haste with which he paced up and down the yard denoted the fever which was burning within. It was necessary that his wife's body should be removed from the prison without delay. He received the communication with perfect calmness and acquiesced in its propriety. Nearly all the inmates of the prison had assembled to witness its removal. They fell back on either side when the widower appeared. He walked hurriedly forward and stationed himself alone in a little railed area close to the lodge gate, from whence the crowd, with an instinctive feeling of delicacy, had retired. The rude coffin was borne slowly forward on men's shoulders. A dead silence pervaded the throng, broken only by the audible lamentations of the women and the shuffling steps of the bearers on the stone pavement. They reached the spot where the bereaved husband stood, and stopped. He laid his hand upon the coffin, and mechanically adjusting the pall with which it was covered, motioned them onward. The turnkeys in the prison lobby took off their hats as it passed through, and in another moment the heavy gate closed behind it. He looked vacantly upon the crowd, and fell heavily to the ground. Although for many weeks after this he was watched, night and day, in the wildest ravings of fever, neither the consciousness of his loss, nor the recollection of the vow he had made, ever left him for a moment. Scenes changed before his eyes, place succeeded place, and event followed event, in all the hurry of delirium, but they were all connected in some way with the great object of his mind. He was sailing over a boundless expanse of sea, with a blood-red sky above and the angry waters lashed into fury beneath, boiling and eddying up on every side. There was another vessel before them, toiling and labouring in the howling storm, her canvas fluttering in ribbons from the mast, and her deck thronged with figures who were lashed to the sides, over which huge waves every instant burst, sweeping away some devoted creatures into the foaming sea. Onward they bore amidst the roaring mass of water, with a speed and force which nothing could resist, and striking the stern of the foremost vessel, crushed her beneath their keel. From the huge whirlpool which the sinking wreck occasioned arose a shriek so loud and shrill, the death cry of 100 drowning creatures blended into one fierce yell, that it rung far above the war cry of the elements, and echoed and re-echoed till it seemed to pierce air, sky, and ocean. But what was that old grey head that rose above the water's surface, and with looks of agony and screams for aid buffeted with the waves? One look, and he had sprung from the vessel's side, and with vigorous strokes was swimming towards it. He reached it. He was close upon it. They were his features. The old man saw him coming and vainly strove to elude his grasp, but he clasped him tight and dragged him beneath the water. Down, down with him, 50 fathoms down. His struggles grew fainter and fainter, until they wholly ceased. He was dead. He had killed him, and had kept his oath. He was traversing the scorching sands of a mighty desert, barefooted and alone. The sand choked and blinded him. Its fine, thin grains entered the very pores of his skin, and irritated him almost to madness. Gigantic masses of the same material, carried forward by the wind and shone through by the burning sun, stalked in the distance like pillars of living fire. The bones of men who had perished in the dreary waste lay scattered at his feet. A fearful light fell on everything around. So far as the eye could reach, nothing but objects of dread and horror presented themselves. Vainly striving to utter a cry of terror, with his tongue cleaving to his mouth, he rushed madly forward. Armed with supernatural strength, he waded through the sand until, exhausted with fatigue and thirst, he fell senseless on the earth. What fragrant coolness revived him? What gushing sound was that? Water! It was indeed a well, and the clear, fresh stream was running at his feet. He drank deeply of it, and throwing his aching limbs upon the bank, sank into a delicious trance. The sound of approaching footsteps aroused him. An old grey-headed man tottered forward to slake his burning thirst. It was he again. He wound his arms round the old man's body and held him back. He struggled, he shrieked for water, for but one drop of water to save his life. But he held the old man firmly and watched his agonies with greedy eyes, and when his lifeless head fell forward on his bosom, he rolled the corpse from him with his feet. When the fever left him and consciousness returned, he awoke to find himself rich and free, to hear that the parent who would have let him die in jail who had let those who were far dearer to him than his own existence die of want and sickness of heart that medicine cannot cure, had been found dead on his bed of down. He had had all the heart to leave his son a beggar, but proud even of his health and strength, he had put off the act till it was too late, and now might gnash his teeth in the other world at the thought of the wealth his remisses had left him. He awoke to this, and he awoke to more, to recollect the purpose for which he lived, and to remember that his enemy was his wife's own father, the man who had cast him into prison, and who, when his daughter and her child sued at his feet for mercy, had spurned them from his door. Oh, how he cursed the weakness that prevented him from being up and active in his scheme of vengeance. He caused himself to be carried from the scene of his loss and misery, and conveyed to a quiet residence on the sea coast, not in the hope of recovering his peace of mind or happiness, for both were fled forever, but to restore his energies and meditate on his darling object. And here some evil spirit cast in his way the opportunity for his first, most horrible revenge. It was summer-time, and wrapped in his gloomy thoughts, he would issue from his solitary lodgings early in the evening, and, wandering along a narrow path beneath the cliffs, to a wild and lonely spot that had struck his fancy in his ramblings, seat himself on some fallen fragment of the rock, and burying his face in his hands, remain there for hours, sometimes until night had completely closed in, and the long shadows of the frowning cliffs above his head cast a thick black darkness on every object near him. He was seated here one calm evening in his old position, now and then raising his head to watch the flight of a seagull, or carry his eye along the glorious crimson path, which, commencing in the middle of the ocean, seemed to lead to its very verge where the sun was setting, when the profound stillness of the spot was broken by a loud cry for help. He listened, doubtful of his having heard aright, when the cry was repeated with even greater vehemence than before, and starting to his feet, he hastened in the direction whence it proceeded. The tale told itself at once. Some scattered garments lay on the beach. A human head was just visible above the waves at a little distance from the shore, and an old man, wringing his hands in agony, was running to and fro, shrieking for assistance. The invalid, whose strength was now sufficiently restored, threw off his coat and rushed towards the sea with the intention of plunging in and dragging the drowning man ashore. "Hasten here, sir, in God's name! Help! Help, sir, for the love of heaven! He is my son, sir, my only son!" said the old man frantically as he advanced to meet him. "My only son, sir, and he is dying before his father's eyes." At the first word the old man uttered, the stranger checked himself in his career and, folding his arms, stood perfectly motionless. "Great God!" exclaimed the old man, recoiling. "Hailing!" The stranger smiled and was silent. "Hailing!" said the old man wildly. My boy! Hailing, my dear boy! Look! Look!" Gasping for breath, the miserable father pointed to the spot where the young man was struggling for his life. "Hark!" said the old man. "He cries once more. He is alive yet. Hailing, save him! Save him!" The stranger smiled again, and remained immovable as a statue. I have wronged you," shrieked the old man, falling on his knees and clasping his hands together. "Be revenged, take my all, my life, cast me into the water at your feet, and, if human nature can repress a struggle, I will die without stirring a hand or foot. Do it, Hailing, do it, but save my boy. He is so young, Hailing, so young to die." "Listen," said the stranger, grasping the old man fiercely by the wrist. "I will have life for life, and here in one. My child died before his father's eyes, a far more agonizing and painful death than that young slanderer of his sister's worth is meeting while I speak. You laughed in your daughter's face, where death had already set his hand, at our sufferings then. What do you think of them now? See there, see there!" As the stranger spoke, he pointed to the sea. A faint cry died away upon its surface. The last powerful struggle of the dying man agitated the rippling waves for a few seconds, and the spot where he had gone down into his early grave was indistinguishable from the surrounding water. 3 years had elapsed, when a gentleman alighted from a private carriage at the door of a London attorney, then well known as a man of no great nicety in his professional dealings, and requested a private interview on business of importance. Although evidently not past the prime of life, his face was pale, haggard, and dejected, and it did not require the acute perception of the man of business to discern at a glance that disease or suffering had done more to work a change in his appearance than the mere hand of time could have accomplished in twice the period of his whole life. "I wish you to undertake some legal business for me," said the stranger. The attorney bowed obsequiously, and glanced at a larger packet which the gentleman carried in his hand. His visitor observed the look, and proceeded. "It is no common business," said he, "nor have these papers reached my hands without long trouble and great expense." The attorney cast a still more anxious look at the packet, and his visitor, untying the string that bound it, disclosed a quantity of promissory note, with copies of deeds and other documents. "Upon these papers," said the client, The man whose name they bear has raised, as you will see, large sums of money for some years past. There was a tacit understanding between him and the men into whose hands they originally went, and from whom I have by degrees purchased the whole, for treble and quadruple their nominal value, that these loans should be from time to time renewed until a given period had elapsed. Such an understanding is nowhere expressed. He has sustained many losses of late, and these obligations accumulating upon him at once would crush him to the earth. The whole amount is many thousands of pounds, said the attorney, looking over the papers. It is, said the client. What are we to do? Inquired the man of business. Do? Replied the client, with sudden vehemence. Put every engine of the law in force, every trick that ingenuity can devise and rascality execute, fair means and foul, the open oppression of the law, aided by all the craft of its most ingenious practitioners. I would have him die a harassing and lingering death. Ruin him, seize and sell his lands and goods, drive him from house and home, and drag him forth a beggar in his old age, to die in a common jail. But the costs, my dear sir, the costs of all this, reasoned the attorney when he had recovered from his momentary surprise. If the defendant be a man of straw, who is to pay the costs, sir? Name any sum, said the stranger, his hand trembling so violently with excitement that he could scarcely hold the pen he seized as he spoke. Any sum, and it is yours. Don't be afraid to name it, man. I shall not think it dear if you gain my object. The attorney named a large sum, at hazard, as the advance he should require to secure himself against the possibility of loss, but more with the view of ascertaining how far his client was really disposed to go, than with any idea that he would comply with the demand. The stranger wrote a cheque upon his banker for the whole amount, and left him. The draft was duly honoured, and the attorney, finding that his strange client might be safely relied upon, commenced his work in earnest. For more than 2 years afterwards, Mr. Hayling would sit whole days together in the office, poring over the papers as they accumulated, and reading again and again, his eyes gleaming with joy, the letters of remonstrance, the prayers for a little delay, the representations of the certain ruin in which the opposite party must be involved, which poured in, as suit after suit and process after process was commenced. To all applications for a brief indulgence, there was but one reply. The money must be paid. Land, house, furniture, each in its turn, was taken under some one of the numerous executions which were issued, and the old man himself would have been immured in prison had he not escaped the vigilance of the officers and fled. The implacable animosity of Hayling, so far from being satiated by the success of his persecution, increased 100-fold with the ruin he inflicted. On being informed of the old man's flight, his fury was unbounded. He gnashed his teeth with rage, tore the hair from his head, and assailed with horrid imprecations the men who had been entrusted with the writ. He was only restored to comparative calmness by repeated assurances of the certainty of discovering the fugitive. Agents were sent in quest of him in all directions. Every stratagem that could be invented was resorted to for the purpose of discovering his place of retreat, but it was all in vain. Half a year had passed over, and he was still undiscovered. At length, late one night, Hayling, of whom nothing had been seen for many weeks before, appeared at his attorney's private residence, and set up word that a gentleman wished to see him instantly. Before the attorney, who had recognised his voice from above stairs, could order the servant to admit him, he had rushed up the staircase and entered the drawing-room, pale and breathless. Having closed the door to prevent being overheard, he sank into a chair and said in a low voice, "Hush! I have found him at last." "No!" said the attorney. "Well done, my dear sir, well done." "He lies concealed in a wretched lodging in Camden Town," said Hayling. "Perhaps it is as well we did lose sight of him, for he has been living alone there, in the most abject misery all the time, and he is poor, very poor." "Very good," said the attorney. You will have the capture made tomorrow, of course." "Yes," replied Hayling. "Stay, no, the next day." "You are surprised at my wishing to postpone it," he added with a ghastly smile. "But I had forgotten. The next day is an anniversary in his life. Let it be done then." "Very good," said the attorney. "Will you write down instructions for the officer?" "No, let him meet me here at 8 in the evening, and I will accompany him myself." They met on the appointed night, and hiring a hackney coach, directed the driver to stop at that corner of the old Pancras Road at which stands the parish workhouse. By the time they alighted there, it was quite dark, and proceeding by the dead wall in front of the veterinary hospital, they entered a small by-street, which is, or was at that time, called Little College Street, and which, whatever it may be now, was in those days a desolate place enough, surrounded by little else than fields and ditches. Having drawn the travelling cap he had on half over his face and muffled himself in his cloak, Hayling stopped before the meanest-looking house in the street, and knocked gently at the door. It was at once opened by a woman, who dropped a curtsy of recognition, and Hayling, whispering the officer to remain below, crept gently upstairs, and, opening the door of the front room, entered at once. The object of his search and his unrelenting animosity, now a decrepit old man, was seated at a bare deal table, on which stood a miserable candle. He started on the entrance of the stranger, and rose feebly to his feet. "What now? What now?" said the old man. "What fresh misery is this? What do you want here?" "A word with you," replied Hayling. As he spoke, he seated himself at the other end of the table, and, throwing off his cloak and cap, disclosed his features. The old man seemed instantly deprived of the power of speech. He fell backward in his chair, and, clasping his hands together, gazed on the apparition with a mingled look of abhorrence and fear. "This day 6 years," said Hayling, "I claimed the life you owed me for my child's. Beside the lifeless form of your daughter, old man, I swore to live a life of revenge. I have never swerved from my purpose for a moment's space, but if I had, one thought of her uncomplaining, suffering look as she drooped away, or the starving face of our innocent child, would have nerved me to my task. My first act of requital you well remember. This is my last." The old man shivered, and his hands dropped powerless by his side. "I leave England tomorrow," said Hayling, after a moment's pause. "Tonight I consign you to the living death to which you devoted her. A hopeless prison." He raised his eyes to the old man's countenance, and paused. He lifted the light to his face, set it gently down, and left the apartment. "You had better see to the old man," he said to the woman, as he opened the door and motioned the officer to follow him into the street. "I think he is ill." The woman closed the door, ran hastily upstairs, and found him lifeless. Beneath a plain gravestone, in one of the most peaceful and secluded churchyards in Kent, where wild flowers mingle with the grass, and the soft landscape around forms the fairest spot in the garden of England, lie the bones of the young mother and her gentle child. But the ashes of the father do not mingle with theirs, nor from that night forward did the attorney ever gain the remotest clue to the subsequent history of his queer client. The end. That's a revenge story now, isn't it? Blimey. Man got angry. I do like Dickens. Yeah, I'm sorry that these stories are kind of in a kind of very dark theme tonight. It's all right. Next month we'll start doing much nicer Christmassy things. So yeah, it's fine, exactly. I mean, yeah, you got... It was a bit sinister, wasn't it? That's one of the few Dickens I haven't actually read. I mean, I obviously skimmed through it earlier, but yeah. I mean, Dickens had a... Oh, hey, Bo, yeah, and hey, Sil. The thing I particularly like about Dickens is he had a very, very sort of strong sense of justice, and a lot of the time in a lot of his books he goes on big old rants about the injustice of like just society in general, and the injustice of how the poor are treated and all of that. So he was a socialist at heart. So, and this is, yeah, obviously one of those kinds of stories. It's just like, fair enough. And yes, good night, Harper's. Oh, thank you. I'm glad it helped. I'm glad it chilled you. Well, not chilled you in that, like, not in a bad way. Not in a kind of, oh, I'm cold. Yes. But, right, I think I shall take, excuse me, I think I shall take a break. And I hope you all can do the same. Go refill liquids, empty liquids, get yourself snack and or drink of some kind, and I shall be back in about 5 minutes. Goodbye for now. And I'm back. Hello. And oh, is everybody getting colds? Yeah, it is the season, isn't it? I hope everybody gets over them quickly, because yeah, seems to be the done thing at the moment. It's like we've had 2 years of, well, pretty much 2 years of being stuck indoors with our immune systems going a bit wonky, and then of course as soon as you get out of that sort of lockdown thing, you get a cold. Ah, joys. Oh, I'm just going to move the mic one sec. Boop. Realised I was sort of had the microphone at my shoulder, because my shoulder is obviously the loudest part of me. I mean, actually, that's not far from the truth. I have a very crunchy shoulder. There we go. But yes, I hope everybody has had a good break. I hope you are all nice and chilled. So, yes. Sorry, just looking at long words. Yeah, so we've had a short story from Persia. We've had a short story from the U of the K. There are actually some translations of like various Beowulf things here, and Anglo-Saxon stuff. But I was all very excited for that, and then the one bit of Beowulf they've got here is like a page long. But, oh, damn it. That's a shame. And I know that somewhere there is, like, somewhere in the house there is an original Anglo-Saxon text of, well, not like original obviously, but you know, there is Beowulf in Anglo-Saxon, but I'm not going to read that because I can't read Anglo-Saxon. But I kind of, yeah, would be quite fun to give it a go. No, there's also one Grimm's fairy tale in this, which I suppose we could do, but it's not that great. I think it's basically Sleeping Beauty, this one, actually. Yeah, and it's just yeah, a couple of pages long. So I'm going to try one more little one, and then I think I've got a couple of French ones, possibly, depending on how we go for time. But yes, this one is another anonymous. It is German, and it's called Eulenspiegel and the Merchant. And it's from Eulenspiegel the Merry Jester. And Eulenspiegel, or I've also heard Till Eulenspiegel, is kind of in like Germanic folklore the sort of trickster character. I suppose sort of a bit like Loki in Norse mythology. You're not entirely sure whether he's human or not. I think most things show him as human, but just very like clever and very good at outwitting I guess gods and other like sort of magical beings and things like that. I think there are other things that say that he's got some kind of fey properties, or he is magical in some way, hence why he sort of gets away with all of these pranks that he plays. But he is sort of a folkloric figure, I believe, in sort of Germanic tradition that's been around since like the 15th century, I want to say 14th century, something like that. So this is one of the little tales that they tell of Eulenspiegel. So, Eulenspiegel and the merchant. In the town of Hedelem there resided a rich merchant, who, happening one day to be walking in one of his own fields a short way out of the city, saw Howleglass lying on the green. He inquired who he was. To this Howleglass replied, "I am a cook without a master, and I have been a cook's servant, otherwise a scullion, but that is now not a place for me." The merchant said, "If you like to become my servant, I will give you good board and wages. Besides your clothes, you shall have a trial, for my wife is continually bickering one after other with all her cooks." Howleglass promised to do his best to please him, and his new master asked his name, to which our hero replied that it was Bartholomew. "The name," said the merchant, "is too long. You should be called Doll." "Sir," said Howleglass, "just as you like it best, it pleases me well." "Then come," added his master, "you are the sort of man I want. Let us go directly into my garden to gather herbs for the young boiled chickens, as tomorrow I have a party coming, and we must make merry with the best cheer." So they went to the house, and when the merchant's wife saw them come in, she said, "Heyday, master mine, what kind of a servant have you brought us here? Are you afraid lest the bread should be left to grow mouldy? What is he here for?" "Oh, you shall see that, my dear, tomorrow. Here, Doll, take this pannier and follow me to the shambles." Away they went, and the merchant brought some pieces of roasting meat, saying on his return, "Now, Doll, remember when you put this sirloin down tomorrow that you leave it to do coolly at a distance, so as not to catch or singe. The boiling piece you may put on a good deal earlier." "Very good, master," said Howleglass. "It shall be done." So the next morning he rose betimes and brought the meat he was to boil near the fire. But that which he intended to roast he stuck upon the spit, and placed it at a cool distance he had been told, namely in the cellar between 2 barrels of beer from the fire. Now, before the merchant's guests had assembled, he went to see that all was going on well in the kitchen, for his wife was a fine lady, and he inquired whether the dinner was almost ready, to which Howleglass made answer, "Yes, everything but the roast beef." "Everything but?" exclaimed the merchant. "And where is that?" "It is on the spit," answered Howleglass. "It is doing cool at a distance, as you desired, in the coolest place in the house, which is the beer cellar. You did not say when you would like to have it roasted." While his master was discussing this point with Howleglass, the guests began to arrive, to whom he candidly related the incident, at which some looked grave and others laughed, while his lady was least of all satisfied with the joke. Indeed, she proposed the ejectment of the new cook from the premises forthwith. "My love," said the merchant, "give yourself no kind of uneasiness about that. Tomorrow I'm going to Golai, and he must see me there, but on my return he shall be discharged." Then they all proceeded to dinner, and made as good cheer as they could upon what they had got. In the evening, when all was over, his master called Howleglass, and said, "Doll, see that my coach is in readiness early tomorrow morning, for I and the priest are going as far as Golai, so look that it be well cleaned and greased." Accordingly, when the whole family were abed, Howleglass proceeded to grease the chariot well, both inside and out. And in the morning our merchant and the priest mounted to drive off, but slip went the priest wherever he laid his hand or foot, and he had many a time nearly broken his neck as they drove along. "What the deuce," he cried, "can it be that is so thick and greasy?" So they stopped and called Howleglass in a great passion, inquiring what vile work he had been doing, and swore and threatened dreadfully. Just then a waggon-load of straw luckily went by, and the unhappy party purchased a small quantity with which to purify the well-bedizened chariot. Quite enraged, the merchant cried out, "Off to the gallows, you rascal!" And soon after Howleglass saw one not far from the roadside, and, driving the chariot right underneath it, he was proceeding very leisurely to unharness the horses. "What is it that you are about, villain?" said his master. "Why," replied Howleglass, "did not you order me to drive off to the gallows, where I thought I was to set you down?" On looking up, the priest and the merchant sure enough saw the gibbet, upon which his master, being seized with a panic, commanded him to back, and drive right away as hard as he could flog. Hearing this, Howleglass dashed neck and nothing through the mud, so that by the horrible pulling and tearing, the vehicle came straight in two, the hinder part remaining with the merchant and the priest stuck in the mud, and the other proceeding with Howleglass and the horses, just as if nothing had happened. At length, with much shouting and running, the merchant overtook his driver, and was beginning to inflict summary vengeance upon him, when the priest came up and prevented him, and in this fashion they contrived to accomplish their journey, and so home again. "Well?" his wife inquired how the merchant had enjoyed his journey. "Oh, delightful!" cried the merchant, "now that we are safely returned." Then he called Howleglass, saying, "Tonight eat and drink to your heart's content, for tomorrow you quit this house. I cannot keep you, you are too great a malicious rascal for me." "All right, master," said Howleglass. And in the morning, when the merchant went out, he again said, "Eat and drink, take as much as you like, but do not let me find you here when I come home from church." So while the family was at church, Howleglass proceeded, as he had been ordered, to take what he liked, and very shortly he had almost completely gutted the house. In short, the merchant met him with a whole load of his goods in the street as he was coming from church. "Ha, my honest cook," he cried, "what are you dressing now?" "What you commanded me to do," replied Howleglass. "You informed me that I might take what I liked, and rid the house of me." "Leave these things where they are," exclaimed the merchant, "and go to the devil if you please." Howleglass said, "I do everything that my masters order me, and yet I cannot live in peace." So he quitted the merchant in a huff, whom he was sorry again to have met with, while the former had his goods conveyed back to the house. I love those kinds of stories. It's like, I'm doing exactly what you told me to do. It's just loopholes. Also, yeah, Howleglass is, like, I guess, an anglicised version of Eulenspiegel. Because Spiegel is mirror in German, I believe. There'll be people in chat who absolutely have way more knowledge of German than I do, but I'm pretty sure Spiegel is mirror. So Eulen, I don't know. But I wonder what the actual translated name is. I would assume it's something similar to, like, yeah, something glass. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, so that's a fun one. I should probably try and find some more of them, actually, because yeah, I'm always a big fan of kind of trickster stories, and I am asking you to do this one thing. No, it's let me find the thingy again now. It's EUL. So it's, let me just type it. It's that. Which is it? Oil? I've always heard it pronounced Eulenspiegel. I don't know if it's Eulenspiegel or Eulenspiegel. I don't know. Yeah, I've only ever heard of it in reference to or first heard of it in reference to a piece by Richard Strauss that is called Till Eulenspiegel's lustige Streiche. Owl mirror. Huh. Is that literally what it is? That's kind of cool. Is that? I wonder if that's some kind of what, some kind of like pun, or like a mirror for the wise or something like that. I don't know, because owls are wise. Or like the opposite of wise, or he's too wise for everybody else. I don't know. I'm just looking into stuff. I don't know. But usually these kinds of names seem to have a lot of yeah, there aren't umlauts over that particular U. Otherwise it would be Eulen. Umlauts are the best. I love it, umlauts. But yeah. I don't know what the I was trying to work out earlier what sort of the UK equivalent of sort of trickster figure, a trickster figure would be. I don't know if we have something similar. I guess like maybe like the Green Man in folklore, but he's not really a fair. Yeah. Do they know this? Far too serious for that kind of frivolity. Quite, yes. Even spell right, yeah. Far too silly. No, can't do that, too silly. Oh dear. But, so yes, I've got a couple of French ones to read. I think I shall read this one next. So Sam will find this funny because Sam was a child. This one is by Honoré de Balzac. Yeah, laugh while you will. And it's called The Mysterious Mansion. And a lot of the French, it's quite interesting because it's sort of similar to kind of like song cycles, as I, again, talking from the perspective of I guess a classical musician, I know sort of the differences of topics and just tones, I guess, of different countries, at least European countries, like what they do in song, like not just folk song, but just any kind of sort of classical, I guess, songs. And the German ones tend to be a lot kind of, they either tend to be very, very dark. Yeah, fair enough. They either tend to be very dark or they tend to be very sort of brooding and philosophical. And then you got the French ones, which are all incredibly raunchy. So I was looking through this, I was like, there are some short stories in here, there are some French short stories in here. Oh, I bet there's going to be some somewhat unsafe for Twitch short stories here. So I've managed to find some that aren't too bad. So oh, good luck for Clara's exam. I hope she does fantastically. I'm sure she will. But yes, I shall begin this one. This is The Mysterious Mansion. About 100 yards from the town of Vendôme, on the borders of the Loire, there is an old grey house, surmounted by very high gables, and so completely isolated that neither tan-yard nor shabby hostelry, such as you may find at the entrance to all small towns, exists in its immediate neighbourhood. In front of this building, overlooking the river, is a garden, where once well-trimmed box borders that used to define the walks now grow wild as they list. Several willows that spring from the Loire have grown as rapidly as the hedge that encloses it, and half conceal the house. The rich vegetation of those weeds that we call foul adorns the sloping shore. Fruit trees, neglected for the last 10 years, no longer yield their harvest, and their shoots form coppices. The wall fruit grows like hedges against the walls. Paths, once gravelled, are overgrown with moss, but, to tell the truth, there is no trace of a path. From the height of the hill, to which cling the ruins of the old castle of the Dukes of Vendôme, the only spot whence the eye can plunge into this enclosure, it strikes you that, at a time not easy to determine, this plot of land was the delight of a country gentleman, who cultivated roses and tulips and horticulture in general, and who was besides a lover of fine fruit. An arbour is still visible, or rather the debris of an arbour, where there is a table that time has not quite yet destroyed. The aspect of this garden of bygone days suggests the negative joys of peaceful provincial life, as one might reconstruct the life of a worthy tradesman by reading the epitaph on his tombstone. As if to complete the sweetness and sadness of the ideas that possess one's soul, One of the walls displays a sundial decorated with the following commonplace Christian inscription, Ultimam Cogita. The roof of this house is horribly dilapidated. The shutters are always closed. The balconies are covered with swallows' nests. The doors are perpetually shut. Weeds have drawn green lines in the cracks of the flights of steps. The locks and bolts are rusty. Sun, moon, winter, summer, and snow have worn the panelling, warped the boards, gnawed the paint. The lugubrious silence which reigns there is only broken by birds, cats, martins, rats, and mice, free to course to and fro, to fight and eat each other. Everywhere an invisible hand has graven the word mystery. Should your curiosity lead you to glance at this house from the side that points to the road, you would perceive a great door which the children of the place have riddled with holes. I afterward heard that this door had been closed for the last 10 years. Through the holes broken by the boys, you would have observed the perfect harmony that existed between the facades of both garden and courtyard. In both the same disorder prevails. Tufts of weed encircle the paving stones. Enormous cracks furrow the walls, round whose blackened crests twine the 1,000 garlands of the pellitory. The steps are out of joint, the wire of the bell is rusted, the spouts are cracked. What fire from heaven has fallen here? What tribunal has decreed that salt should be strewn on this dwelling? Has God been blasphemed? Has France been here betrayed? These are the questions we ask ourselves, but get no answer from the crawling things that haunt the place. The empty and deserted house is a gigantic enigma, of which the key is lost. In bygone times it was a small fief, and bears the name of the Grand Bertèche. I inferred that I was not the only person to whom my good landlady had communicated the secret of which I was to be the sole recipient, and I prepared to listen. "Sir," she said, "when the Emperor sent the Spanish prisoners of war and others here, the government quartered on me a young Spaniard who had been sent to Vendôme on parole. Parole notwithstanding, he went out every day to show himself to the sous-préfet. He was a Spanish grandee, nothing less. His name ended in os and dia, something like Burgos de Frédéria. I have his name on my books. You can read it if you like. Oh, but he was a handsome young man for a Spaniard, for they are all said to be ugly. He was only 5 feet and a few inches high, but he was well grown. He had small hands that he took such care of. Ah, you should have seen. He had as many brushes for his hands as a woman for her whole dressing apparatus. He had thick black hair, a fiery eye. His skin was rather bronzed. I liked the look of it. He wore the finest linen I have ever seen on anyone, although I have had princesses staying here, and, among others, General Bertrand, the Duke and Duchess d'Abrente, Monsieur Decazes, and the King of Spain. He didn't eat much, but his manners were so polite, so amiable, that one could not owe him a grudge. Oh, I was very fond of him, although he didn't open his lips 4 times in the day, and it was impossible to keep up a conversation with him, for if you spoke to him, he did not answer. It was a fad, a mania with them all, I heard say. He read his breviary like a priest. He went to mass and to all the services regularly. Where did he sit? 2 steps from the chapel of Madame d'Hermeret. As he took his place there the first time he went to church, nobody suspected him of any intention in so doing. Besides, he never raised his eyes from his prayer book, poor young man. After that, sir, in the evening he would walk on the mountains among the castle ruins. It was the poor man's only amusement. It reminded him of his country. They say that Spain is all mountains. From the commencement of his imprisonment he stayed out late. I was anxious when I found that he did not come home before midnight, but we got accustomed to this fancy of his. He took the key of the door, and we left off sitting up for him. He lodged in a house of ours in the Rue de Caserne. After that, one of our stablemen told us that in the evening, when he led the horses to the water, he thought that he had seen the Spanish grandee swimming far down the river like a live fish. When he returned, I told him to take care of the rushes. He appeared vexed to have been seen in the water. At last, one day, or rather one morning, we did not find him in his room. He had not returned. After searching everywhere, I found some writing in the drawer of a table, where there were 50 gold pieces of Spain that are called doubloons, and were worth about 5,000 francs, and 10,000 francs worth of diamonds in a small sealed box. The writing said that in case he did not return, he left us the money and the diamonds, on condition of paying for masses to thank God for his escape and for his salvation. In those days my husband had been not taken from me. He hastened to seek him everywhere. And now for the strange part of the story. He brought home the Spaniard's clothes that he had discovered under a big stone, in a sort of pile work by the riverside near the castle, nearly opposite to the Grande Bretèche. My husband had gone there so early that no one had seen him. After reading the letter, he burned the clothes, and according to Count Federier's desire, we declared that he had escaped. The sous-préfet sent all the gendarmerie in pursuit of him, but they never caught him. Lepard believed that the Spaniard had drowned himself. I, sir, don't think so. I am more inclined to believe that he had something to do with the affair of Madame de Merret, seeing that Rosalie told me that the crucifix that her mistress thought so much of, that she had it buried with her, was of ebony and silver. Now, in the beginning of his stay here, Monsieur de Federier had one in ebony and silver that I never saw him with later. Now, sir, don't you consider that I need have no scruples about the Spaniard's 15,000 francs, and that I have a right to them? Certainly, but haven't you tried to question Rosalie? I said. Oh, yes, indeed, sir, but to no purpose. The girl's like a wall. She knows something, but it is impossible to get her to talk. After exchanging a few more words with me, my landlady left me a prey to vague and gloomy thoughts, to a romantic curiosity, and a religious terror not unlike the profound impression produced on us when, by night, on entering a dark church, we perceive a faint light, under high arches. A vague figure glides by, the rustle of a robe or cassock is heard, and we shudder. Suddenly, the Grande Bretèche and its tall weeds, its barred windows, its rusty ironwork, its closed doors, its deserted apartments, appeared like a fantastic apparition before me. I essayed to penetrate the mysterious dwelling and to find the knot of its dark story, the drama that had killed 3 persons. In my eyes, Rosalie became the most interesting person in Vendôme. As I studied her, I discovered the traces of secret care, despite the radiant health that shone in her plump countenance. There was in her the germ of remorse or hope. Her attitude revealed a secret, like the attitude of a bigot who prays to excess, or of the infanticide who ever hears the last cry of a child. Yet her manners were rough and ingenuous. Her silly smile was not that of a criminal, and could you but have seen the great kerchief that encompassed her portly bust, framed and laced in by a lilac and blue cotton gown, you would have dubbed her innocent. No, I thought, I will not leave Vendôme without learning in the history of the Grande Bretèche. To gain my ends, I will strike up a friendship with Rosalie, if needs be. Rosalie, said I one evening. Sir, you are not married? She started slightly. Oh, I can find plenty of men when the fancy takes me to be miserable, she said, laughing. She soon recovered from the effects of her emotion, for all women, from the great lady to the maid of the inn, possess a composure that is familiar to them. You are too good-looking and well-favoured to be short of lovers, but tell me, Rosalie, why did you take service in an inn after leaving Madame de Merret? Did she leave you nothing to live on? Oh, yes, but, sir, my place is the best in all Vendôme. The reply was one of those that judges and lawyers would call evasive. Rosalie appeared to me to be situated in this romantic history like the square in the midst of a chessboard. She was at the heart of the truth and chief interest. She seemed to me to be bound in the very knot of it. The conquest of Rosalie was no longer to be an ordinary siege. In this girl was centred the last chapter of a novel. Therefore, from this moment, Rosalie became the object of my preference. One morning I said to Rosalie, "Tell me all you know about Madame de Merret." "Oh," she replied in terror. "Do not ask that of me, Monsieur Horace." Her pretty face fell. Her clear, bright colour faded, and her eyes lost their innocent brightness. "Well, then," she said at last, "if you must have it so, I will tell you about it, but promise to keep my secret." "Done! My dear girl, I must keep your secret with the honour of a thief, which is the most loyal in the world." Were I to transcribe Rosalie's diffuse eloquence faithfully, an entire volume would scarcely contain it, so I shall abridge. The room occupied by Madame de Merret at the Bretèche was on the ground floor. A little closet, about 4 feet deep, built in the thickness of the wall, served as her wardrobe. 3 months before the eventful evening of which I am about to speak, Madame de Merret had been so seriously indisposed that her husband had left her to herself in her own apartment, while he occupied another on the first floor. By one of those chances that it is impossible to foresee, he returned home from the club, where he was accustomed to read the papers and discuss politics with the inhabitants of the place, 2 hours later than usual. His wife supposed him to be at home, in bed and asleep. But the invasion of France had been the subject of a most animated discussion. The billiard match had been exciting. He had lost 40 francs, an enormous sum for Vendôme, where everyone hoards and where manners are restricted within the limits of a praiseworthy modesty, which perhaps is the source of the true happiness that no Parisian covets. For some time past, Monsieur de Merret had been satisfied to ask Rosalie if his wife had gone to bed, and on her reply, which was always in the affirmative, he had immediately gained his own room with the good temper engendered by habit and confidence. On entering his house, he took it into his head to go and tell his wife of his misadventure, perhaps by way of consolation. At dinner he found Madame de Merret most coquettishly attired. On his way to the club, it had occurred to him that his wife was restored to health, and that her convalescence had added to her beauty. He was, as husbands are wont to be, somewhat slow in making this discovery. Instead of calling Rosalie, who was occupied just then in watching the cook and the coachman play a difficult hand at brisk, Monsieur de Merret went to his wife's room by the light of a lantern that he deposited on the first step of the staircase. His unmistakable step resounded under the vaulted corridor. At the moment that the Count turned the handle of his wife's door, he fancied he could hear the door of the closet I spoke of close, but when he entered, Madame de Merret was alone before the fireplace. The husband thought ingeniously that Rosalie was in the closet, yet a suspicion that jangled in his ear put him on his guard. He looked at his wife and saw in her eyes I know not what wild and hunted expression. "You are very late," she said. Her habitually pure, sweet voice seemed changed to him. Monsieur de Merret did not reply, for at that moment Rosalie entered. It was a thunderbolt for him. He strode about the room, passing from one window to the other with mechanical motion and folded arms. "Have you heard bad news, or are you unwell?" inquired his wife timidly, while Rosalie undressed her. He kept silent. "You can leave me," said Madame de Merret to her maid. "I will put my hair in curl papers myself." From the expression of her husband's face, she foresaw trouble, and wished to be alone with him. When Rosalie had gone, or was supposed to have gone, for she stayed in the corridor for a few minutes, Monsieur de Merret came and stood in front of his wife, and said coldly to her, "Madame, there is someone in your closet." She looked calmly at her husband, and replied simply, "No, sir." This answer was heartrending to Monsieur de Merret. He did not believe in it. Yet his wife had never appeared to him purer or more saintly than at that moment. He rose to open the closet door. Madame de Merret took his hand, looked at him with an expression of melancholy, and said in a voice that betrayed singular emotion, "If you find no one there, remember this, all will be over between us." The extraordinary dignity of his wife's manner restored the Count's profound esteem for her, and inspired him with one of those resolutions that only lack a vaster stage to become immortal. "No," said he, "Josephine, I will not go there. In either case it would separate us forever. Hear me, I know how pure you are at heart, and that your life is a holy one. You would not commit a mortal sin to save your life." At these words, Madame de Merret turned a haggard gaze upon her husband. "Here, take your crucifix," he added. "Swear to me before God that there is no one in there. I will believe you. I will never open that door." Madame de Merret took the crucifix and said, "I swear." "Louder," said the husband, "and repeat, 'I swear before God that there is no one in that closet.'" She repeated the sentence calmly. "That will do," said Monsieur de Merret coldly. After a moment of silence, "I never saw this pretty toy before," he said, examining the ebony crucifix inlaid with silver and most artistically chiselled. "I found it at Duvivier's, who bought it of a Spanish monk when the prisoners passed through Vendôme last year." "Ah," said Monsieur de Merret, as he placed the crucifix on the nail. And he rang. Rosalie did not keep him waiting. Monsieur de Merret went quickly to meet her, led her to the bay window that opened onto the garden, and whispered to her, "Listen, I know that Gorenflot wishes to marry you. Poverty is the only drawback, and you told him that you would be his wife if he found the means to establish himself as a master mason. Well, go and fetch him, tell him to come here with his trowel and tools. Manage not to awaken anyone in his house but himself. His fortune will be more than your desires. Above all, leave this room without babbling. Otherwise—" He frowned. Rosalie went away. He recalled her. "Here, take my latchkey," he said. "Jean!" then cried Monsieur de Merret in tones of thunder in the corridor. Jean, who was at that same time his coachman and his confidential servant, left his game of cards and came. "Go to bed, all of you," said his master, signing him to approach, and the Count added under his breath, "When they are all asleep, do you hear? You will come down and tell me." Monsieur de Merret, who had not lost sight of his wife all the time he was giving his orders, returned quietly to her at the fireside and began to tell her of the game of billiards and the talk of the club. When Rosalie returned, she found Monsieur and Madame de Merret conversing very amicably. The Count had lately had all the ceilings of his reception rooms on the ground floor repaired. Plaster of Paris is difficult to obtain in Vendôme. The carriage raises its price. The Count had therefore bought a good deal, being well aware that he could find plenty of purchasers for whatever might remain over. The circumstance inspired him with the design he was about to execute. "Sir, Gorenflot has arrived," said Rosalie in low tones. "Show him in," replied the Count in loud tones. Madame de Merret turned rather pale when she saw the mason. "Gorenflot," said her husband, "go and fetch bricks from the coach-house, and bring sufficient to wall up the door of this closet. You will use the plaster I have over to coat the wall with." Then, calling Rosalie and the workman aside, "Listen, Gorenflot," he said in an undertone, "you will sleep here tonight. But tomorrow you will have a passport to a foreign country, to a town which I will direct you. I shall give you 6,000 francs for your journey. You will stay 10 years in that town. If you do not like it, you may establish yourself in another, provided it be in the same country. You will pass through Paris, where you will await me. There I will insure you an additional 6,000 francs by contract, which will be paid to you on your return, provided you have fulfilled the conditions of our bargain. This is the price for your absolute silence as to what you are about to do tonight. As to you, Rosalie, I will give you 10,000 francs on the day of your wedding, on condition of your marrying Gorenflot. But if you wish to marry, you must hold your tongues, or no dowry." "Rosalie," said Madame de Merret, "do my hair." The husband walked calmly up and down, watching the door, the mason and his wife, but without betraying any insulting doubts. Madame de Merret chose a moment when the workman was unloading bricks and her husband was at the other end of the room to say to Rosalie, 1,000 francs a year for you, my child, if you can tell Gorenflot to leave a chink at the bottom." Then out loud she added coolly, "Go and help him." Monsieur and Madame de Merret were silent all the time that Gorenflot took to brick up the door. This silence on the part of the husband, who did not choose to furnish his wife with a pretext for saying things of a double meaning, had its purpose, On the part of Madame de Merret, it was either pride or prudence. When the wall was about halfway up, the sly workman took advantage of a moment when the Count's back was turned to strike a blow with his trowel in one of the glass panes of the closet door. This act informed Madame de Merret that Rosalie had spoken to Gorenflot. All three of them saw a man's face. It was dark and gloomy, with black hair and eyes of flame. Before her husband turned, the poor woman had time to make a sign to the stranger that signified hope. At 4 o'clock, towards dawn, for it was the month of September, the construction was finished. The mason was handed over to the care of Jean, and Monsieur de Merret went to bed in his wife's room. On rising the following morning, he said carelessly, "The deuce! I must go to the mairie for the passport." He put his hat on his head, advanced 3 steps toward the door, altered his mind, and took the crucifix. His wife trembled for joy. "He is going to Duvivier," she thought. As soon as the Count had left, Madame de Merret rang for Rosalie, and then, in a terrible voice, "The trowel! The trowel!" she cried, "and quick to work. I saw how Gorenflot did it. We shall have time to make a hole and to mend it again." In the twinkling of an eye, Rosalie brought a sort of mattock to her mistress, who with unparalleled ardour set about demolishing the wall. She had already knocked out several bricks, and was preparing to strike a more decisive blow, when she perceived Monsieur de Merret behind her. She fainted. "Lay Madame on her bed," said the Count coldly. He had foreseen what would happen in his absence, and had set a trap for his wife. He had simply written to the mayor, and had sent for Duvivier. The jeweller arrived just as the room had been put in order. "Duvivier," inquired the Count, "did you buy crucifixes of the Spaniards who passed through here?" "No, sir." "That will do, thank you," he said, looking at his wife like a tiger. "Jean," he added, "you will see that my meals are served in the Countess's room. She is ill, and I shall not leave her until she has recovered." The cruel gentleman stayed with his wife for 20 days. In the beginning, when there were sounds in the walled closet, and Josephine attempted to implore his pity for the dying stranger, he replied, without permitting her to say a word, "You have sworn on the cross that there is no one there."